Her eyes were wide open. It wasn't a metaphor, it was literal. The moment the coffin was opened, everyone in the room froze. The expression frozen on that pale face was not one of peace, it was one of unease, a fixed gaze, hard and direct, as if she were still there, as if she were looking at someone specific among the mourners. And at that instant, doubt settled in. Who would let someone be buried like this? And more, why? Was it merely an aesthetic choice for the funeral, or was there something behind that last silent gesture? Perhaps a deadly secret, a secret that she took with her, or better yet, that they tried to bury with her. This image, simple yet profoundly disturbing, began to circulate through murmurs, exchanged glances, uncomfortable silences. There was something nobody was saying, but that everyone felt. Have you ever witnessed a situation where everything seems normal on the outside, but something in the air tells you that something is very wrong? This story is like that, a case where the crime, if it happened, was never acknowledged. The pain was muffled, the facts were denied, and justice never arrived. What remained was the discomfort of a gaze, and that discomfort still haunts those who were there that day. The woman in the coffin was not a stranger. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend, a neighbor, a person with a routine, with a social life, with secrets, and perhaps with fears that nobody noticed in time. When silence is stronger than the scream, truth becomes fragile. And that is where danger arises. That is where true terror begins. When a victim can no longer speak for herself, and when those who could speak choose silence. The most unsettling aspect of this story is not just what happened, it's everything that didn't happen. No serious investigation, no in-depth forensic analysis, no culprit pointed out. The case was archived with the coldness of a stamp. But her gaze, that gaze frozen in time, still seems to accuse someone. Not with words, but with presence, as if to say, you know what you did, and I know you are here. Have you ever felt that something was watching you, even when everyone around you seemed distracted? There is a name for this in criminal psychology. The feeling of being observed by an unspoken truth, an invisible guilt, a detail that your mind picks up, but the world insists on ignoring. And when it comes to poorly explained deaths, that feeling transforms into a constant echo, haunting the collective conscience. Stay with me until the end, because what you are about to discover may surprise you. There are stories that are not found in the records, that don't appear in newspapers. They live in the subtext, in uncomfortable memories and heavy silences, and this is one of them. A story where the victim may never have rested, because the truth was buried along with her. And it was exactly in that silence, dense, suffocating, almost rehearsed, that everything began to crumble. Because what seemed like just another burial, like so many others, hid a story many preferred to forget. But her gaze does not allow that. It remains, it accuses, and it asks, without sound, without words, who is willing to listen to what no one else has had the courage to tell? If this type of story bothers you, if it stirs something inside you, if you have ever experienced something similar or simply felt that tension while listening, I want to know. Leave in the comments what has touched you the most so far. Sometimes, what you write helps someone else realize that they are not alone in feeling that something needs to be said. Your opinion is part of that process. And yes, that's how this space transforms into a safe place for us to reflect together. If this content is making sense to you, leave a like now. Not only because it helps the channel, but because it shows that you value this type of narrative, this kind of listening, this attempt to give voice to those who have been silenced. It is with each like that the video reaches more people, and with each subscription that I can continue bringing these stories with the care and respect they deserve. So if you want to keep tracking cases like this, with depth, empathy, and that necessary discomfort that provokes reflection, subscribe now. It's free, takes a second, and makes a huge difference for those who produce and for those who watch. Your participation here is what keeps this project alive. But this story is just beginning, because soon after that burial, with the open gaze and the weight in the air, people began to remember details, things that didn't make sense, questions that were never answered, and that's when the truth starts to reveal itself. not in the screams, but in the silences. The death certificate stated, "Natural causes, an unexpected cardiac arrest according to the attending physician. Nothing to justify alarm, no signs of violence, no cuts, no stains. The body, apparently intact, was released quickly." But there was something the papers couldn't hide. The dense atmosphere that spread among those present, as if everyone were pretending to believe in a version that no one could fully swallow. The silence was deafening. No one said anything, but the glances spoke volumes. The neighbor who used to see her at the market quietly remarked, "She was different in the last few weeks." The brother averted his gaze every time someone asked about the previous night. The best friend, strangely absent from the funeral, was seen crying alone in her car. None of them said a word officially, but each gesture, each hesitation was a non-verbal whisper. It was as if there were a hidden truth that everyone perceived, but no one wanted to be the first to bring to light. Perhaps out of fear. Perhaps out of guilt, or worse, out of convenience. It is in these situations that the line between coincidence and choice blurs. What seems like an accident can, at its core, be the result of a series of silent choices. Words that were never spoken. Help that was never given. Warnings ignored. The human mind in these cases tries to find logic in what has no explanation. And that's when the versions, the theories, and the gossip begin to drag on for years. All behind the scenes of a death that, on paper, seemed simple, but which, in the hearts of those left behind, turned into a labyrinth without an exit. There is something particularly disturbing when what bothers the most is not what was done, but what was not done. A cry for help that never came. A cold gesture that went unnoticed. A change in behavior masked by an automatic smile. Her death did not scream, it whispered, and perhaps that's why it was so ignored. Because facing the possibility that someone beside us is suffering in silence requires a transformation of mindset. It requires truly looking, and that for many people hurts more than simply moving on with the official excuse. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because there are details of this story that were never recorded, but that speak more than any report. Discrete clues, words that when connected, reveal more than they seem. And it is in this invisible layer that the real impact of this story resides. She was one of those people who went unnoticed in crowds, but left silent marks on those who paid attention. Always polite, always helpful, always with a light smile on her face. But it was precisely that always that unsettled the few who really knew her. Because nobody is always like that. Nobody smiles so often without hiding something. And her eyes told a story that was completely different from what her mouth said. Have you ever seen someone like that? Who seemed fine, but all it took was a second of silence for everything to crumble inside. In the neighborhood, they said she was closed off, but never rude. She worked from home, cared for her elderly mother, avoided parties, had an almost invisible rhythm. But some say that invisibility is also a form of defense, a way to avoid difficult questions, to avoid explaining certain behaviors, to escape memories one doesn't want to relive. And that was exactly the case with her, a woman who seemed to be protecting herself from her own history, carrying the weight of old decisions and traumas that were never named on her back, as if life had taught her that silence is safer than exposure. She had a boyfriend, according to reports, but it was someone who appeared rarely. Friends spoke cautiously about him, always avoiding going into details, and that in itself said a lot. A relationship where everything is hidden too much usually has something more behind it. A veiled tension, a fear disguised as routine, an emotional submission that leaves no marks on the body but suffocates from within. Have you noticed that in someone close to you? The kind of relationship that seems stable on the outside but deep down functions like an emotional prison? Understanding who she was helps us comprehend why so many questions remain unanswered to this day. The way someone lives can hide important clues about how that person died. And the most frightening thing in this case is realizing that perhaps she left signs, small, discreet, scattered among gestures, words, and choices. But no one connected the dots. Or worse, those who did connect them preferred to ignore them. And when the truth begins to bother more than it comforts, the instinct of many is to silence it. But the pain that is silenced does not simply disappear, it transforms. In the 7 days leading up to her death, something changed. Those who were closer felt the difference, even if they couldn't quite name what it was. She began to respond to messages late, avoided phone calls, and when she did answer, spoke softly, as if she were monitoring her own tone. The simple and almost predictable routine gave way to small blackouts of presence. She would disappear for a few hours, skip going to the market at her usual time, avoid meetings, even with her mother. It was as if she were trying to escape. From someone, from something, or even from herself. A remote work colleague reported that she sent an incomplete email, something rare for someone who was always meticulous. On the same day, she wrote to a distant friend with the phrase, "If something happens to me, you know, right?" But she never explained what she meant by that. The friend thought it was a joke. She laughed, ignored it, and now she can't get those words out of her head. It's strange how we only give weight to certain phrases when it's too late. This shows how our perception sometimes only awakens when the damage has already been done. That week her eyes seemed deeper, and no matter how hard she tried to maintain a calm demeanor, there was a hidden tremor in her hands, a hidden tension in her jaw. The body begins to react before the mind accepts that it is in danger. And the cruelest part of this journey is that no one noticed, or if they did, they didn't have the courage to act. Fear often paralyzes not just those who suffer, but also those nearby. And that's why so many tragedies happen behind the scenes of daily life, where pain hides behind automatic gestures and mechanical smiles. It was during that week that she sought a therapist, but didn't make it to the first session. She cancelled the day before, claiming that she wasn't ready, and maybe she never really was. Maybe she knew deep down that there was no more time, or maybe someone made her believe that. It's frightening to think that silence can be as decisive as action, that an absence can have more impact than any scream, and that a simple change in behavior can carry a cry for help that no one deciphered in time. Now, I want to delve even deeper into this subject because there is a fine line between what seems like coincidence and what reveals a pattern. And when we look closely at the details of that last week, we begin to realize that her fate may have been sealed long before the end. Comment: the signs were there. Sometimes recognizing this is already a step toward never ignoring what seems small, but carries an entire scream inside. Among all the people who were part of her routine, there was one who always generated a subtle discomfort, the kind of presence that seemed harmless at first glance, but carried an unexplainable tension in the air. He was polite, helpful, always around when someone needed, always ready to assist with some small favor. But there was something in the way he behaved when it came to her. When asked about the two, he would change the subject. When talking about the last few days, he either overshared or undershared, and in both cases his eyes avoided contact. Close friends noticed inconsistencies in his statements. At first he said he hadn't seen her in 2 days. Then he claimed to have spoken with her on the day of her death. Small lapses that, when added up, raised alarms. And it wasn't just that. During the wake, he became excessively nervous when someone mentioned the possibility of a new autopsy. His hands trembled, he sweated, and changed the topic with an almost rehearsed quickness. His demeanor wasn't one of mourning, it was one of fear. As if a simple misplaced word could bring to light something he was struggling to keep buried. This type of behavior is not uncommon in poorly conducted investigations. People emotionally connected to the victim often know more than they let on, and this, in criminal psychology, is a recurring pattern. Proximity grants access, and access, when misused, turns into control. The cruelest part of all this is that, in most cases, those who commit such acts do not act in the heat of the moment. They act slowly, manipulating others' perceptions, isolating the victim little by little until she has nowhere left to run. And when the outcome arrives, the world simply accepts the most convenient version, because the absence of a serious investigation is not just an institutional failure. It reflects how many times our collective mentality prefers not to see what is right in front of our eyes. There was no detailed forensic examination. There was no consistent interrogation, just a short note in the local newspaper, followed by an uncomfortable silence, and the man who was always there continued living as if nothing had happened. The haste with which the case was closed spoke more than any technical report. In less than 48 hours, everything had been resolved, at least on paper. The death was recorded as natural without thorough examination, without collecting relevant data, without even a formal interview with the victim's closest people. No routine reconstruction, no analysis of emotional history, no cross-referencing of information. It was as if there were an urgent desire to archive that story, to push the pain under the rug with a stamp, a signature, and no questions asked. One of the more observant neighbors even went to the police station to report a strange noise coming from the apartment 2 days before the death. According to him, it was a dry sound followed by hurried footsteps on the stairs around 3 a.m., but the report was never even filed. The on-duty officer claimed that it didn't change the outcome since the report indicated no physical aggression. And there lies one of the most dangerous flaws in the system, blind faith in appearances. Because not all violence leaves visible marks, and many deaths are not the result of a single act, but of a sequence of negligence that was never investigated. Furthermore, the victim's phone was released to the family before any technical analysis. The device was already unlocked, with deleted messages and no records of recent calls. A close source revealed that the suspect himself had access to the phone before the official handover. This alone compromised any possibility of tracking digital clues. In many countries, this type of error would be grounds for immediate reopening of the case, but here it was just another forgotten detail amid bureaucracy. A mistake that blends into the routine of so many other cases where the truth has never been a priority. Because when we talk about justice, we are not just discussing laws, we are talking about mentality, about how the institutional gaze often comes contaminated by haste, prejudice, and indifference. The system should investigate to the end, but when there is no external pressure, no public outcry, and no media involvement, the truth simply loses its strength. And those who have left disappear again, only this time within a closed file. Among the many details surrounding this story, the most disturbing remains that gaze, fixed, intact, open, as if not even death could end what it needed to say. At wakes there is a silent agreement. Eyes should be closed, faces serene, as a symbolic gesture of rest. But there, in front of everyone, she seemed to be wanting the opposite. Her eyes did not ask for peace. They pointed, as if each person in that room had something to understand, or something to fear. It was a gaze that did not shy away, did not hide. A gaze that disturbed because it spoke more than any voice would have the courage to. In criminal psychology, the gaze plays a much deeper role than it seems. It is a silent language capable of revealing guilt, fear, intention, even anger. That's why interrogations often focus less on what a person says and more on how she looks at the other. The gaze escapes rational control. It exposes what the speech tries to hide. And when we talk about victims, this phenomenon becomes even more powerful. Because even without a voice, the body leaves messages. And the face is the last battleground between what has been lived and what has been hidden. Some believe it was a mistake by the funeral home. But there are also those who say the family requested that the eyes remain that way. And between these two extremes, there is a third layer, much more symbolic. Perhaps it was she herself, in her last moment of consciousness, who decided not to close her eyes, as if she refused to disappear silently, as if she knew that, more than any report, that gaze would be the only one capable of keeping the question alive. What happened to her? Because some truths scream through the body even after the voice goes silent. Some pains refuse to die. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because when we think of the background of these kinds of scenes, we begin to see the impact that small gestures have on collective perception. Those open eyes were the trigger for everything. It was them that made friends take a step back, that made neighbors quietly wonder what they really knew, that even made the most skeptical for a second feel that something was off. Sometimes, what the mouth doesn't say, the gaze reveals, and it's impossible to unsee. Comment: there are gazes we never forget. because certain images linger in the mind precisely because they carry questions that no one had the courage to answer. What's most frightening about this type of story isn't just what happened, but what was left aside afterward. Because when the dirt was thrown onto the coffin, it wasn't just her body that was buried. It was also the possibility of justice, of answers, of restitution. It's as if, little by little, everyone around decided to move on, even knowing that there was something unresolved lingering in the air. Social silence acts like this. It doesn't shout, doesn't confront, doesn't accuse. It simply settles. And the danger lies right there, in normalizing something that should be investigated to the end. In many communities, the discomfort of truth is heavier than the comfort of denial. Admitting that something serious happened requires facing gazes, memories, guilt, and omissions. So the quickest way is to be silent, to pretend not to have seen, not to know, not to remember. And when this becomes the norm, stories like this multiply. Cases that do not make headlines, names that disappear from records, faces that exist only in the memory of those who, for some reason, chose to keep what they know. Impunity in these scenarios does not begin in the justice system. It starts at home among familiar faces. It is not an exaggeration to say that the truth in this type of journey is often treated as a threat. Because it does not come alone. It carries responsibilities, dismantles versions, exposes mistakes, and lays bare wounds. And not everyone is prepared for this kind of transformation. In many cases, it is easier to maintain the silent pact than to revisit the backstage of a conclusion that could have been avoided. But this choice comes with a price, the price of living with a hidden truth that sooner or later begins to manifest, whether in glances, in symptoms, or in the discomfort that never passes. Because this story is not unique, it reflects a larger structure, a social pattern that repeats with alarming frequency. There are mothers who remain silent to protect their children. There are friends who avoid questions to avoid involvement. There are neighbors who prefer not to know, so they don't have to act. And in the end, silence ends up protecting not the one who suffered, but rather those who should be confronted. The absence of answers does not silence the pain, it transforms it. And those who remain live with ghosts that no one sees. The E. Brother, who didn't want to believe the signs, now revisits mentally every conversation. The friend, who noticed the strange look during their last meeting, relives that scene every day. The neighbor who heard a noise in the early morning repeats to herself, "It wasn't my business." But what once was merely doubt has turned into guilt. And this kind of guilt is treacherous, and because it doesn't scream, it whispers all the time that maybe you could have done something and didn't. Regret in this kind of journey is not punctual. It drags on. It appears at unexpected moments, in a similar news story, in a random conversation, even in dreams. It's as if the mind is constantly trying to reorganize the facts to find an escape, a justification, any excuse that relieves the weight of not having acted. But the truth is, when silence becomes a choice, it comes at a high cost. And those who suspected something but chose not to mention it begin to bear the impact of a decision that seemed small but changed everything. This is a delicate point, because no one wants to feel responsible for a tragedy. And many times there really was no way to foresee the outcome. But there is a thin line between not knowing and choosing not to know. And it is precisely this choice that leaves marks. Because when the truth comes to light, or when even without emerging it insinuates itself with enough force, regret cruelly settles in. A grief that is not fully lived, a knot that does not unravel over time. And all of this becomes even harder when, around them, no one wants to touch the subject. Because admitting the pain of others also requires courage, because understanding the pain of those left behind is recognizing that silence does not only affect the victim, it spreads, it infiltrates relationships, destroys trust, generates distance, and worse, it teaches. It teaches to be quiet, to avoid, to look the other way. But what if it were with someone you love? Would you have the courage to speak up? Comment here. I would have done differently. Sometimes this kind of reflection is the first step to breaking the cycle. There is something too symbolic about that gaze that refused to close, as if, in a final silent gesture, she was saying, "It's not over yet." And maybe it really isn't over. Because some stories do not end with a death certificate or a well-tended grave. They remain alive, vibrating in what was hidden, in what was not said, in what no one had the courage to face. Perhaps she never found peace precisely because she knew that the truth was left unfinished. Or worse, was completely ignored as if it had never mattered. While everyone tried to move on, it was as if that gaze was there to remind, not just of what happened, but of what still needs to happen. A kind of presence that persists, that does not disappear with time, because it carries a weight that does not belong only to her, but to all who chose silence. That's what makes this case so uncomfortable. The absence of justice becomes an open wound that crosses generations. And no one truly finds rest, while what is pending continues to echo in the backrooms of collective memory. The truth is that there are stories that do not accept a full stop. They lurk, hovering over ordinary days, waiting for someone to see them, with new eyes, with courage, with clarity, with responsibility. Perhaps she kept her eyes open for that reason. Not by accident, nor by a technical failure, but as a message, as a plea, as a sign, because deep down, she knew that if her eyes closed completely, everything would end there. And she couldn't let that happen, not with everything left unanswered, not with so many unresolved issues. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because we need to talk about what happens when a case never has a resolution, neither legal nor emotional nor symbolic. When the feeling of impunity continues to spread and feed the cycle of silence that has already caused so much impact. This is the true essence of a hidden truth. It does not disappear, it transforms into unrest, into discomfort, into memories that refuse to fade. Some eyes may close, but they do not fall silent. If this case touched you in some way, leave a comment. I heard her silence. That's how we know who made it to the end, who felt along with the story, and who understands the weight of stories like this. If you want to continue following content that provokes questions and dives deep into the backstage of the human mind and hidden truths, subscribe to the channel. This helps this space to grow and primarily keeps this conversation alive. Oh, and if the video made you think, reflect, or simply held your attention till now, leave a like. It's this simple gesture that shows it's worth continuing to bring up such themes. Now, if you still feel that sense of unease, there's a story where the truth was buried with a person, but their grave was empty that is very interesting and you cannot miss. Click and continue with me over there.